Hi, and welcome to Books in Action. My name is Larry Petraccaro, and I'm here with my co-host, Melissa Kopecky, Director of the South Orange Public Library. And our guest this evening is a local author, Marina Budhos. Marina has written a number of books, both fiction and nonfiction, a number of articles, and we're going to talk to her a little bit about what she's written. So, Marina, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we have had the pleasure of talking to you before, but that was a couple books back. So, and I certainly don't mind going back over. But your latest book is The Long Ride,
Yes.
which just came out,
That's right.
and it's a YA book, which for people who don't know what YA literature is, it's young adult, which is also called teen. That's a hangover from a really long time ago. That they were called young adults, but it named a whole genre. So what is it like doing a publicity tour for a book written for teens? Who are you talking to that might be different
that's a great
from
question.
an adult?
So I've done I do different kinds of events because sometimes for my young adult titles, because a lot of my titles are still embedded in larger issues that I think adults would be just as interested in, if not more so perhaps. This latest book, The Long Ride, is actually about integration in the 70s and busing, which is also just as relevant now. So one of my events was more an adult event, and so I actually did, the novel is set in the 1970s, and I did a 1970s pop quiz that was about sort of some of the cultural things that were going on. Did people remember it, or did they know of it? And also some of the serious things that were going on, sort of the demographics that was causing a lot of the conflict around integration. But I also do a lot of school visits. I'll be doing a school visit in January where I'll be working with the school and the kids will all be reading it. So that's very different. You're sort of keying it to the audience of teenagers, and this book is a little on the younger side from what I've done before. My other stuff has been a little more upper YA. So these will be like 7th graders, and it's sort of capturing their energy, and they always ask lots of questions like, they want to know about the book, but they also want to know about you. That often happens with kids.
I was actually really delighted with that slightly younger because well, I love the idea of being drawn into a story, but that also has a bigger picture context. And some of the issues that you've dealt with are things that are really very serious issues, as is this, but this is such a good spin-off to talking about it with younger teens or even like preteens or tweens or
absolutely.
whatever.
Absolutely, because the girls in the book, it's 3 girls in the book, Jamila, Josie, and Francesca, and it's really about that little tipping point that they're at, which is 12 to 13, and that's sort of a sweet spot. It's a very innocent moment, in a sense, where they're just beginning to have those first experiences. So I really wanted to tap into that voice and that experience. But of course, there's this larger tipping point that's going on in the book, which has to do with an experiment at school segregation, integration, to break up segregation in the 1970s in this New York City community.
And we should say that it's sort of flipped, right? Can you explain that? Because certainly adults or people who lived through that era, who would all be adults now, have a sort of a one-dimensional view when you hear the word busing, even though you know it's wider than that. So can you explain the context?
Yeah, so one of the reasons, part of the impetus to wanting to do this novel was that I felt like the story of integration is always told. We think of it sort of Little Rock, Arkansas. We think of the Marshalls. We think of those extremely highly confrontational moments that happened in the 50s, perhaps the early 60s, when schools were being forced to integrate, particularly in the South. But the reality is most integration plans happened around the country, very much in the North, during the 70s, because there were sort of a series of Supreme Court decisions that if districts had sort of not gotten on board, they then had court mandated pressure to integrate their school systems. So really, to me, the wave that affected so many people had to do with all these desegregation plans that happened in the 70s. So in fact, all different kinds of plans were happening. Sometimes it was African American kids being bused into white districts. Sometimes it was the other way around. In the case of this story, which is actually based on a plan that happened in the community that I grew up with, it happened to sort of the older kids, just a few years older than me, was that it's a larger white community, and those kids are being bused to South Jamaica, which is a traditional black community. What's different here is that my three girls, the girls that I'm writing about, are mixed race. And so they were already outsiders in this white community that they've grown up in. And in essence, their parents personally integrated the community. They were the first to arrive in that neighborhood. And now the girls are being bused along with the white kids. And sort of, where do they belong, right? They're being bused finally into a community of color, but they've grown up in a different way. And there are class differences, too.
That, to me, was infinitely fascinating, and even touches a bit on immigration in the parents.
That's right.
And the choices that you make about where you live or how you identify yourself, and which I want to ask one more question, and then I'm going to be quiet and let Mary ask some questions. But when I was pulling books that we had that you've written, this is Conversations, and it was really interesting because this is one of your books I had not pulled out.
Oh.
And it's from a while ago.
Yeah.
Like 20 years ago?
So 1999, yeah.
So isn't that weird? Okay,
Yes.
not going there. But Conversations with Immigrant Teenagers, and I thought how you would reflect on how you went from here to there, because there's obviously a lot of straight lines, but I'm sure a lot of convoluted lines as well.
Well, you could say that Remix was the book that got me doing books for young adults. It was my first book for young adults. I'd actually previously published 2 adult novels, and then I sort of went out interviewing these teenagers. Now, a little side note is that this book was cooked up with someone who would then become my husband and co-author, Mark Aronson. So he was my editor on that book. And so he kind of pulled me into this world and this idea. So part of what was great about doing that book, The Straight Line, is that it just got me so interested in young people's stories. Clearly, stories of immigrant teenagers who don't fit in, teenagers who may be invisible to an American audience. You know, that's obviously a territory that really interests me. And also the opening of Remix opens in Queens, and this is set in Queens. So Queens also plays a thread in a lot of not all of my books, but a number of my books are set in Queens.
Well, I take a look at your website, as I mentioned before, Marina. It looks like one of your themes has been that kind of, I don't know if outsider status is the wrong, but somebody not quite fitting in. Mm-hmm. So you've written, have you written a number of books along that line in the young adult?
I think that's true. I mean, Ask Me No Questions was about an undocumented family right after 9/11, and that very difficult period. Mm-hmm. In fact, when there was a Muslim Registration Act, and it's sort of about a family that's kind of stranded and not quite sure what to do during that period. It's kind of interesting because it's so, like, we're seeing all the echoes of many of the same things going on now. Tell Us We're Home is about 3 immigrant girls whose mothers are maids and nannies in a fictional town, a little bit like Maplewood. It's an M town, but I kind of pulled from different towns around. There's another novel that's not here called Watched, which is about
that was checked out.
That's great. I'm glad to hear that. But it's also an outsider novel in a way. It's, again, a teenager, Muslim teenager, who is, he gets in trouble with the law and becomes an informant. So he's kind of that insider-outsider, right? Like that outsider status. He's also an insider in his community, and sort of the moral dilemma that, that he's placed in a way.
These are all, I gather, relatively contemporary. Have you written
Yes.
anything because the kind of problems we're facing with immigration and the disassociation people may have with the community have to go back hundreds of years or so. Have you ever thought about or written anything back in that time frame?
So there's a few things I'm working on. I should say. So there's some things that are in progress that fit exactly what you're talking about. I have an historical novel that I've just completed called The Letter Writer, and it's actually it's set on a sugar plantation in the Caribbean. So it is about migration because it's about indentured. It's about the Indians who had come to the sugar plantations. They sort of, once slavery was abolished, it was Indians who were brought over. That's my family's background, and so I sort of swirled that into, that's a book in progress right now. I am actually, I have a new YA that I'm working on now called Sanctuary, and it is about a family that takes sanctuary in a synagogue. So it's contemporary, but embedded in there is going to be a World War II story of somebody's grandmother who was a refugee and was forced to hide out, to sort of show that resonance between then and now. So I have played a little around with history a little bit.
Okay. Well, that history is, I think it keeps, one of you mentioned before about the problems that right after 9/11 seem to be becoming resonant again.
Yes, exactly.
With our social situation. So I guess whoever said it is right. History, if you're not careful, I guess it keeps repeating itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because this book, Eyes of the World, which I did with my husband, which is about Robert Capa and Gerda Tauer. Robert Capa is sort of our most famous, I would say, photojournalist. But this is the story of when he was less known, before he kind of became the figure that he became. And his partner was Gerda Tauer. And both of them were refugees in Paris in the 1930s. And they went off to photograph the Spanish Civil War and, in essence, invented modern photojournalism. So when you say echo, we were really immersed in the 1930s while we were writing this book, and my goodness, there was so much that was going on in the 1930s in Europe that feels, parallel to what's going on right now. So it was very strange. It was like being in an echo chamber.
Yeah, I can imagine. We're going to have to take a break in a minute, but in less than a minute. But when we come back, you talked about sugar and the indentured servants, the Indians coming over. I think that's probably certainly it's a part of history I had no familiarity with at all. I don't know, Melissa, if you did. And
well, I learned a lot from reading that book,
we'll ask about
which
that
is
then.
right up there with the kind of book I love to absorb, that has a lot of visuals, a lot of historic materials, a lot of writing, beautiful writing.
Yeah, that when I saw it on the website, that just the title really just attracted me. But anyway, we'll come back. So if you'll stay with us, we're going to have to take a break for a minute. We'll be back in a minute, and we'll continue our conversation with Marina Budhos.
It's an onion.
Hi, and welcome
I'm
back to Books in
pretending.
Action. Okay. This is Larry Petraccaro again with my co-host, Melissa Kopecky, and we're interviewing our guest, author Marina Budhos. And just before the break, we were talking about sugar. Marina had mentioned during the course of the conversation that one of the books, I think one of the books you had written was about, or thinking about writing, is about the indentured servants who came over from India who had to work on the sugar plantations after slavery became, was
Abolished,
abolished.
in
That's
in
the
the
word I
British
was looking
Empire.
for,
Yeah, it was abolished quite a bit before the U.S.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
1934.
Yeah, I've read about that. 1834 probably.
I mean, I'm sorry, 1830. Did I say 1934? My goodness, 1834.
Well, we were talking about the 1930s
Yeah,
before
yeah.
and the similarities
Exactly.
that we see to
Exactly.
today. But maybe we can talk a little bit about that, because the title alone just really intrigued me. So how
Right.
did sugar change the world?
Oh, and I just, wait a minute, you can answer that question in a second, but I know I was looking at the book, but right before we had said, we had jumped from photojournalists to the sugar book and how they impact your later work, but also I talked about that it has wonderful collection of things, and I mean, there's drawings in here that this was before there were photojournalists,
yeah,
so these drawings from like the Illustrated London News and things that were just showing, oh, isn't this interesting? This is how sugar is being made, and you look at them from today's perspective, and it's a little bit horrifying.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think one of them was a children's book that actually explained how sugar came into your home, and when you sort of think about what that process is and who was involved and what was involved, as you say, it's somewhat horrifying.
Oh, yeah, and that must be the children's book one. So, yeah, I'm sorry, you can,
No, it's interesting that you say horrifying, because I don't know where, but I read somewhere that that the people who had to work on the sugar plantations were really brutalized. It was a terribly difficult thing. That I guess.
Yeah,
they
sugar is a
died.
brutal crop, and one of the reasons is because sugar is unlike any other crop in that it cannot be siloed. Once it is cut, because the cane in essence turns woody, and then it's of no use. So it must be processed within 24 to 48 hours. So once you have a harvest, it's this kind of brutal thing where they're kind of cutting the cane. They've got to get the cane over to the boiling house. The boiling house is on sort of 24/7, and this cane is being pressed through the rollers or whatever the system they have for crushing the cane. Because in essence, what's different about sugar is it's a blend between being an agricultural process and a factory process. And so it's really both is going on at the same time. It is a process. The way you get sugar is you have to crush it, you get the pulp, and then it is boiled and boiled and boiled until this moment of crystallization, and then there's a kind of sifting and that we get. And then we also get the dregs, and we also get rum from that, and so forth. There's all these other byproducts. But the point is that it is a very relentless cycle. And so people were worked to exhaustion. The conditions are extremely dangerous. The boiling house in particular, I mean, the temperatures there, they scalding baths and so forth. And, I don't want to get into any of the graphic details. Some of them are in the book itself, but, it's sort of like the show must go on. People, So a very interesting fact is that in a state like Louisiana, where sugar was the crop, not cotton actually, sugar's the main crop, the death rate exceeded the birth rate.
Really?
Because the sugar crop, again, is such a relentless process.
Well, what got you interested in sugar? What drove the need for sugar? Was it the rum, or was it something else?
Rum is a byproduct.
Well,
And
it's a
so
byproduct.
rum was, so the interesting thing about sugar is it began as something quite obscure. I mean, it was a spice, it was something that was used in ritual in India, for instance, and it was medicinal. But it was a very, very rare thing. I mean, it was in essence, it cost the king's ransom to buy your little chunk of sugar. It was kept under lock and key, for instance. But what drove its popularity was, in essence, you could say imperialism or colonialism. So you had, let's say, the British Empire, which had all of these various colonies. And what's going on in England at that time, of course, is you have the Industrial Revolution. So you have all these people going and working in factories, working long days. How are they going to fuel those long days? So what do they have is they have tea, sweetened with sugar, powers them through. They have a hunk of bread that's dipped in the tea
Okay.
or coated with sugar. That's the beginning of a cookie, in essence, or a power bar in today's parlance. And so you start to have this appetite for sugar that's fueled by workers in the industrial world or industrializing world. And how is that made? It's made with slaves and eventually indentured workers. So the sort of need for sugar just went, it just boomed in the 18th century and 19th century.
Was sugar a New World crop, or was it brought to the New World, to the Western Hemisphere? From
Well, it was in
someplace
New
else?
Guinea that we have our first knowledge of it.
New Guinea?
Yes. But it's been brought around. The way it came actually, so we then had a sighting where Alexander the Great recorded a sighting of it, or his general recorded a sighting of it as he was crossing over into India. He talked about the sweet reed. So we have these different sightings, and then there are some early scriptures in India that reflected the use of sugar being boiled down for what was called almost in essence like a gravel-like substance. But the big change happened when sugarcane was then brought to the Arab world, where it was developed. The plantation actually was first developed in the Arab world,
Really?
kind of in Egypt.
Okay.
And so what you had was you had your first sort of sugarcane plantations happening in that area in the Canary Islands, and it was Columbus who brought the sugarcane with him
Really?
when he came to the New World.
Okay.
So that's sort of how all the sugarcane then sprang up in Jamaica and Cuba and Brazil, and that's how it then spread.
So it went all the way
Yeah,
around
it
the
sort of
world.
circled around,
Circled over,
exactly.
yeah.
And how much do you know of your family's own story of going through that?
Okay. So I know some of it, and I've had this very exciting recent development in knowing more of it because of the beauty of 23andMe has reunited me with all of these cousins who are descendants of the people who had come over from India. This one man, this one my great-grandfather. So I know the story of my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother. So my great-grandfather actually came from a sort of largish village in the north of India. He was one of three brothers. And it was in the 1870s, and he decided to sell his share of land. He sold his share to his brothers and set off for British Guyana, what was then British Guyana. They were recruiting all these Indians to work the sugar plantations. In his case, when he was on the ship, he was appointed to be a sardar, and a sardar is it's like you're a step below the British,
Okay.
and you're in charge of like 25 men. And so then he was brought over to a large plantation called Port Morant, and he became a sardar there, and he did his indentured. He eventually married a woman named Leal Moni, who had come over as a child. Again, her whole family migrated to work the sugar plantations.
From India as well?
Exactly, yeah. There was this large migration of Indians in the sort of the latter half of the 19th century coming over to, in this case, British Guyana, but it was also Trinidad, Mauritius, South Africa.
Did they
all of
tend to
these
come from one
places.
part of India or through the country in general?
I would say about 80% of them came from the north, and sort of Bihar, Uttar Pradesh was the largest area, and then they were sort of recruited and brought down through the Calcutta depot and put on boats and brought out of Calcutta. But there was about 20% that came from South India.
From South India. And when did your family move to the United States?
My father
Where's your father?
immigrated in the 50s, in the late 40s, 50s, early 50s, yeah.
That's fascinating.
Which brings us back to the long ride,
Okay.
because that story continues
Yes.
there in Queens, and obviously has some relation to it. I wanted to go back to the long ride because
Sure.
I wanted to say one of the things that I loved about it. I loved Sugar too. I mean, the book.
No, but I want to hear. I'm
But,
happy to hear.
Was that the artist, creating art becomes a point of contact
Yes.
between, and sort of a sense of identity for one of the three girls. And I really liked that piece of it. And I'm using that also to lead into this, because this is beautiful and I want to hold it up. And you showed this to me before we went on the air. And tell me a little bit about how this was
So
created.
it sort of goes back to the origin of the long rides. I had been doing some autobiographical material about growing up in Queens, it's the 70s, just sort of evocative essays. And I was delving into that material before I set out to write this fictional story, because this is a fictional story, but I was in it. And I was approached, after I was done with the long ride, I was actually approached by a reading series called the Broadside Reading Series. And it pairs writers with artists to create these limited edition broadsides. And the artist will take a piece of writing and they'll be inspired by it and they will create something. And so it's this limited edition. They do 100 of them with a letterpress. And so I gave her a little swatch of writing that just evoked summertime evenings in Queens in the 70s. There was just something about that I really wanted to do something with. And she created this gorgeous piece of work out of it.
Well, your writing is beautiful too. Do we have time to read?
To read it? I think so.
Go ahead.
Okay, I will read it.
Putting you on the spot here, but it's
That's
beautiful.
fine.
Fine.
Early 70s. We are always sitting out on the concrete patios, always the air thick and dusty pink with humidity. Always the women sit in their new culottes under the porch lights. Their elbows rest on aluminum armrests. Their thighs glow. Always we girls are in hot pants and shorn-off denim. There is a restful, middle-aged ease among the parents. They laugh. The highways flow in and around us. The buses grind down Union Turnpike, spitting off the grit of the city. We will not abandon Manhattan, even with its graffiti scrawl. It is twinkling in the distance, a solid hike to the subway. Evenings we see the men come home, wilted, their white shirts gluey with sweat. The teenagers are sneaking away to protest, smoke joint in the thatch of darkness that is the green. Shadows deepen, the nights moist with promise. My best friend and I grow restless, amble to the playground, where there are boys, skinny like us, molting into new bodies. We swing in the scooped-out leather seats, the same ones where we once pushed our dimpled knees and tease and flirt. Hey, come lie on my Sealy Posturepedic mattress, one boy keeps calling. Our skins flush. We giggle. We are not popular or fast. We are the younger sisters, eyes wide, watching, pretending. And then we return to the adults, to the patio, to the huge tree that sheds its brittle pods. In the fall, I will whiff their whiny odor, as if the secret to the future lies in the death of things. We are the pause. We have paused the commotion toward the suburbs, the restless American highway energy. We choose this.
Thank you, Marina. And with that...
That was awesome, and we couldn't top it, so if we came right to the end, that's absolutely
That's
perfect.
the way it works. So thank you for joining us on Books in Action, and thank you, Marina. Thank you, Melissa.